Okay, welcome everyone to our STAMPS webinar series. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Mariel Pettee. Dr. Pettee is an assistant professor of physics and the Bernice Durand Faculty Fellow at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And previously, she was a Chamberlain postdoctoral fellow at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and she received her PhD in physics from Yale University. Mariel's research involves developing machine learning methods for astrophysics and particle physics, and she's building scientific foundation models with a focus on representation learning in multimodal and multidisciplinary scientific data. And today, Mariel would talk about invisible cities, imagining the next era of AI-enabled fundamental physics research. So, Mariel, please take it from here.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. Um, because of my setup, I'm still figuring out the best way to configure this on my multiple screens, but I can't see any of you. So if you raise your hand, I just invite you to speak up and you can feel free to interview me and ask any questions you like. Um, I'll also say it's funny to give this talk now, thinking that, what we imagine as the next era of AI-enabled fundamental physics research, even the definition of that seems to change on a weekly basis. But my talk is not going to be talking about agentic AI in physics. It's talking about how we represent physics data. So I want to sort of ground the talk in data itself and some of the particularities of physics data and how we use AI kind of as another way to frame questions about the data on its own. So on a big picture, I want to start with a metaphor that I think many of us are probably familiar with, which is moving to a new city. And for instance, I've been partially based in New York for a couple of years now, and upon moving to a new city, it can be a completely overwhelming experience. The complexity, the scale, um, it boggles the imagination, and no one human brain can really comprehend everything that's happening here. So I think it's natural when you move to a new place, you just go to your neighborhood, you try to understand like what is on my block, like what is in my immediate surroundings. Where do I get bagels and pizza and Thai food? Um, but it's clear that, knowing your block is not the same as understanding your city. There are a lot of other layers and there's a lot more extensiveness to a city. So to truly know a city, once you move there, you quickly learn it's not just your block, but maybe it's also public transportation or the subway system. And if you were just walking around on the surface of New York, you would never know that there's actually this critical layer that's informing the development of the city on top of it. And so to truly know the city, you have to kind of overlay your understanding of the surface with the understanding of what's happening in the subway lines underneath you. Um, but this alone is not the only other layer to consider. There's all kinds of different frames and layers and maps to understand a city. So for instance, maybe not just the subway, but maybe you also want to look at the history of the city that you're living in. Um, I always find this kind of fascinating, the these old maps of New York when it was still New Amsterdam. And so this is kind of like rotated. It's the tip of Manhattan, and you can see the wall that defines Wall Street as we know it today. So just knowing this in the back of your head can really inform the richness with which you perceive a single entity like a city. So subways, history, maybe you want to forget about people entirely and just think about the geologic structure of the city. And it turns out that there's different stone and rock formations, and depending on what types of rocks were in different parts of the city, that kind of informs like what types of structures can be built on top of those things. So even from a deep history, geologic perspective, there's stuff to understand about what informs the development of the city that you live in. Um, Arguably, though, maybe the most important maps to understand a city are, for instance, the best pizza places in New York. So it's also about the way that you interact with the city and the pieces of it that are important to you. So I'm sure we all have like our own versions of this in the places where we live. But the point I want to make is that us as humans getting to know a city or the place that we live is maybe not so different from us as scientists getting to know the one universe that we live in. We have all these different detectors that are trying to understand different pieces of this one singular universe at different scales. Um, they can perceive different types of information, but ultimately, we're all taking maps of kind of the same universe that we operate in. So this kind of motivates. This is like an intuitive picture of what I'm describing. And then in more concrete terms, in statistical scientific terms, what that can mean is, maybe I think of a goal of myself as a scientist or a physicist is trying to construct a wide-ranging, multi-layered, and data-driven representation of our universe that is not meant to, replace my existing scientific understanding, but rather it's to complement it and to deepen it, much in the way that sort of synthesizing lots of different maps of New York is not the same thing as living in it on a day-to-day basis, but it's a critical way to understand this one city. So to be specific, by these terms that I've highlighted here, wide-ranging might include multi-detector, multidisciplinary data sets that are aggregated together. Multi-layered, I'm referring to the idea of modalities, which I'll define later on in the talk. And then data-driven. So really trying to let the data speak for itself as best as we can, which usually means that we turn to self-supervised learning strategies that don't require labels in our data. So you could call this a foundation model, but I think, maybe more helpful is just to think about like why we're doing this in the first place. And so to me, the goal is not just to build a gigantic model. The goal is to synthesize many diverse perspectives into a single repository, say, that can interface with the different layers. And so right now, the object that kind of describes that might be a foundation model. I think another useful metaphor to kind of motivate some of this development is, of course, to turn to the foundation models that we interact with frequently on a day-to-day basis now. And there's this metaphor that you might have heard of ChatGPT as a blurry JPEG of the web. And the reason why I like this is that it really emphasizes that these foundation models are built using data sets, but they are not the same thing as those data sets. They are sort of this like other alternate synthesis. And so no one's saying that ChatGPT is trying to replicate the internet, but rather it's built using the information of the internet and it's configuring it into this alternate form. So it's not the internet, it's something different. And those two kind of objects complement each other in the way that they're constructed. And so hopefully a foundation model of physics might be able to do this for us. It's not the same as physics knowledge aggregated and consolidated over time, but it serves as kind of a counterpoint to our existing information and knowledge. So we've seen foundation models in mainstream ML applications, especially for text, images, video, speech, and also multimodal models that integrate those different information sources together into a single model. And so kind of the crux of my talk is sort of, I mean, I don't have a clear answer to this question necessarily, but it's like a framing question is to what extent will physics data present new challenges for the existing methods that we've seen that are successful at building foundation models in industry? Um, so with this as kind of like an overarching question of my talk, I wanted to go through a couple different ways that physics data might have particular qualities that are worth considering, and maybe even giving special consideration in building methods to analyze and integrate this type of data. Um, of course, physics data has many particularities, and so you might imagine for yourself just a couple of the different particularities of the data that you're interested in or you tend to analyze. I probably won't cover all of the different particularities that you can imagine in this talk, but I came up with around six different high-level topics to sort of uh, just, thinking big picture, what makes my data maybe distinct from a lot of industry standard settings. So, so the talk today, I'm just going to lightly touch on a couple of these different particularities of physics data. I'll give some recent examples of how um, ML applications in the physical sciences have tried to address these types of particularities. And then by the end of the talk, we'll try to speculate about kind of what this means for how we build foundation models built on scientific data and especially physics data. Cool. So starting off first, I think maybe at least for me, the most intuitive particular physics quality that comes to mind when I think about physics data that makes it different from, images scraped from the internet or text is that we have this beautiful history of theoretical physics and mathematics that grounds us in very strong theoretical predictions that we just don't have for human beings or messier types of data. So, arguably, this is kind of like the first thing that we might consider when we're thinking about physics data. And in particular, with physics data, we often talk about symmetries. There are very rock solid symmetries that we see across a number of different data sets, whether that's rotational or other types of gauge symmetries. And we know that neural networks can handle symmetries pretty well. We have examples of including symmetries in our methods, whether we want our methods to be invariant to certain symmetries or equivariant, so sort of aware of those same symmetries, but just acknowledging the overall magnitude of maybe the action. And a lot of our neural networks, like convolutional neural networks, do this by design, thinking about, for instance, translation symmetries or rotational symmetries. And we've also seen that we can do this for much more sophisticated symmetries, such as, for example, some of the symmetries involved in the standard model of particle physics. We can build specialized neural networks that are equivariant under various group actions like these. That said, already we kind of hit maybe an interesting tension or an interesting question in the field right now is you would think that this is one of the more obvious ways that our physics data is special and requires special treatment. And yet arguably, it seems like right now, these benefits of building specialized equivariant networks for our data are really most striking when our data is limited. And what we're seeing now is that in the limit of maybe infinite data events, it's less clear what the explicit benefits are for building equivariant or symmetry-aware methods. Which is not to say that this is, doomed as an enterprise, but is more just to sort of set up that it might not be obvious the relationship between the particularities of physics data and how we actually need to treat it in practice as we build large-scale models. Um, and I think it also sets up for us that these questions themselves might be scale dependent. Like the question of when they're useful or when they're not useful likely will change as models get larger and have more capacity. So already maybe we have like a gut intuition about what should be essential that maybe is not as critical as we might have thought, especially as model sizes get larger and data sets get larger. And in general, this sort of prompts us to think about, okay, well, how should we represent our data? How best should we present our physics priors to our model, or should we present those priors at all? And so maybe you can think of this as a spectrum between prescribed structure versus fully learned structure, where maybe by prescribed, I mean kind of contorting our data to fit within industry standard formats like regular 2D images or sequences or point clouds. Maybe somewhere in the middle is something that is more physics informed, that is explicitly invariant or equivariant. And then maybe on the far end is, fully self-supervised, fully learned, where we're using a very light hand and we're not trying to impose a lot of physics structure in the representation itself. Another quick note on this is that another consequence of our deep theoretical grounding is a benefit, which is that we often have high quality simulations that follow from that theoretical grounding. But also we have quite a rigorous standard for interpretability in many settings. And so this also might inform the way that we need to construct large scale integrations of physics data. Because, for instance, you might have a model that can make really nice, accurate predictions, like the model that's shown in this figure here. This is a paper that kind of went viral last summer. Um, and then actually predicting the force laws of such a model, we can see that the force laws are totally incoherent. Even though we might be able to adapt this learning paradigm so that the model has to learn a well-tuned internal world model. Um, that is a choice that we have to impose into our learning framework. So there sort of remains this open question of how much sculpting, how much physics information do we want to bake into our architectures or our learning methods so that either the predictions are accurate or that just the internal world model is accurate and interpretable. So, okay, so kind of a more generic uh, way of understanding physics data. And now to get into some more specifics, which is, even if we wanted to combine data from many different detectors, say, this is not at all as easy as just making a data set with images taken from many different cameras. The cameras that we use to take pictures for internet scale data, um, they have different granularities, but they're quite regular in structure. And the granular details don't matter as much to us in terms of the semantics of what they're capturing. But in physics, we care a lot about these distinctions, and also the cameras, so to speak, that we're using are way more complex, and they're often irregular. They have different granularities, or they might be quite sparse, or they might be heterogeneous, combining different layers of a detector with different structures. So in order to even attempt to combine data sets from across physics detectors, we need to be able to publish our data in a format such that they can correct for any detector-specific biases as best as we can. So some recent ways that physicists like to try to publish data without detector effects. Um, One way that we can do this is through high-dimensional and unbinned unfolding strategies. So, for instance, in particle physics, the way sort of like a task that we might be confronted with is that we measure the uh, the distribution of, say, the momentum of a jet that we are interested in. But we know that this is not actually the true physics that was captured before, uh, without our detector included. We know that our detector has some inefficiencies and some irregularities, and so there will be some level of smearing or uh, distortions of the true physics that we care about measuring. So one way to tackle this is to learn a reweighting function that's based on the ratio of the probability densities of these two distributions. So there's the measured distribution and the true distribution. We want to learn how to kind of sculpt the measured distribution to look more like the true distribution by learning a likelihood ratio. And uh, as an aside, the way that we like to do this is that classifier functions can be used or reused to approximate a likelihood ratio, meaning that if you train a neural network that classifies just between two classes, say using a sort of traditional binary cross entropy loss, we know that a function that minimizes this expression is going to satisfy the following. So for any small variation, you can reduce it to this expression. And so from here, we can explicitly derive this relationship between the classifier function that we learned, so f of x, this optimal function, and then the two probability distributions, PA and PB. And so here on the left, we have this sort of rescaling of our trained classifier function. And then on the right, we have our likelihood ratio. And so this is how physicists can learn this ratio in practice. So we can put this into practice. Say we can do this for 2 dimensions at a time. Maybe we want to measure the jet momentum as well as the jet rapidity. And in fact, this is how a lot of LHC measurements are currently reported is, they're published as, in this case, binned differential cross sections at the particle level for maybe 1 or 2 observables at a time. So they might look something like this, where this is basically a 2-dimensional measurement because it's measuring one property in bins of another, which is why it looks like there's 6 plots here. But the way that, uh, or rather like a recent strategy in particle physics to do this on a much larger scale and further as an unbinned measurement, um, uses neural networks to learn that likelihood ratio for many different observables at once. So just in cartoon format, maybe you take 24 different observables and you learn this reweighting function that can be applied to on an event level to all of the different properties in each event in order to shape them to look more like your true distribution. And so, in fact, this is what has been done in recent years. And this is what the actual measurements look like. You can unfold your data in this unbinned way and then compare it with Monte Carlo predictions in order to improve, say, your Monte Carlo. And some additional benefits of this kind of flexible format of this unbinned, unfolded data is that you can then construct new observables. So for instance, you can take the ratio of 2 observables that were unfolded to get an object that was not part of your original set of observables. And then you can apply additional cuts. So maybe you want to apply a cut in the phase space so that way the denominator doesn't go to 0. You can apply that cut. And you can construct even more sophisticated observables that are a function of some number of different inputs. And maybe you don't even just want to look at a single observable, but you want to look at the average of one observable in bins of another, say. So this just allows for a lot of kind of creativity and flexibility in how we use this data and how we hopefully can combine it with other data sets in the future. And there's hope that this can also be moving towards really like integrating results across detectors because this has not just been done for a single detector like the Atlas measurement that I just showed. This has been done for a number of different experiments, Atlas, CMS, H1, LHCb, STAR, and T2K. So this is starting to pick up quite a lot of momentum and is kind of shaping how many different experiments are choosing to publish data in a more future-oriented perspective. So a couple other particularities about physics data. So, say we manage to publish our data, we can remove some sort of detector distortions. It still doesn't necessarily help the fact that the format of our data is might be fundamentally kind of incompatible in its basic form. So this forces us to really think about the representation of our data and how we choose to construct embeddings of each of our various data formats themselves. And this is particularly juicy in physics because physics data comes in all kinds of custom formats that are not obvious. It's not obvious how to natively combine, particle physics data, fluid dynamics simulations, LIGO data, astrophysics images, or point clouds. So the way we kind of handle this like huge zoo of different data formats is to think about multimodal methods and thinking about particular data representation strategies. So often, physicists will build custom embeddings or tokenizers or at least encoders for each of these different data types. This works seemingly quite well. Potentially, this is tedious as we think about scaling this up to many different inputs at the same time. But we have some nice recent examples of, thinking of ways to embed jets in a particle physics context or in an astrophysics context. Maybe you want to embed the spectrum of a galaxy. So we've constructed kind of careful embedding schemes for these types of physics objects that we might care about. It's also interesting to consider, especially as we scale up to maybe dozens or more of different inputs, if there is an alternative to this kind of custom embedding paradigm. So there, kind of the alternative structure to this might be to instead move towards like a generic embedding, which could mean, for instance, text-like or language-like, where maybe we imagine having all of our data kind of structured as text files or CSV files or JSON files with formatting, but nevertheless with like a very kind of like the most flexible input format. And this is not an easy road, but it's still interesting to sort of scope out what that might look like. It's not obvious as an embedding scheme at all because rendering data as text, while it might be very easy to combine, and that's its huge benefit, the reality is that language tokenizers are not really built for mathematical abilities or for handling highly numerical data sets. We've seen this in a number of examples, but just as an illustrative example, we've seen that language models out of the box without tool use really struggle to understand rules of basic arithmetic like multiplication. And so if you can test these models specifically on zero-shot multi-digit multiplication or addition problems, you find that they can produce results that look kind of order of magnitude correct, but then in fact are incorrect. And even though this is for GPT-4, even more recent and larger models like DeepSeek also they might sort of memorize larger numbers of multi-digit multiplication, but they don't specifically learn the rules underlying multi-digit multiplication, which is why they still fail once you get to a large enough combination of digit by digit. So it's better understood now that this kind of core challenge is due to the tokenization of language, and existing LLMs use tokenizers that are not really meant to distinguish what makes numbers different from other types of language tokens. And they also have to be kind of finite dictionaries. And so this causes huge challenges when we think about tokenizing continuous numbers. So one possibility here would be to add, say, a specific dedicated numerical token with a magnitude that can scale with the number itself. So if the number is larger, then its embedding is kind of stretched in embedding space to represent the magnitude of that number. And this was an interesting case study to just kind of understand, can dedicated numerical encodings enable us to process physics data in language form? And we found that it performed maybe better than you might expect. In distribution, it produced pretty nice, smooth predictions. And it really shone in terms of out of distribution predictions compared to some of the baseline language tokenizers for numbers, in that it closely replicated this kind of interpolation out of distribution. And also this embedding scheme was also able to predict time series data, even though it was not trained autoregressively. So it could be that we end up, pursuing further this idea of like a generic embedding for lots of diverse data types that would not require us to have dedicated tokenizers. More likely now, it seems like dedicated tokenizers are not too bad of a trade-off in terms of how we represent physics data. But I did want to emphasize too that it's seeming more and more that language or text is going to continue to be critical in how we think about representing our data, partially because text is a modality in itself. And, prior to this current era, we didn't really design physics analyses to think about text as like an important source of information. But of course, we have quite a lot of context about our physics data in the form of language. And that context can be important for a model that's trained on very multi-scale or very diverse sources to be able to understand what makes these two images distinct. What considerations should a model use as it processes data like this. And what motivates this idea a little bit further is the idea that other foundation models, for instance, time series foundation models, have shown in recent years that context or metadata in the form of text can help to constrain the uncertainty of the output of various predictions, especially if they're trained across very diverse settings. And so increasingly, I think we might find that text will need to be incorporated as one of these modalities in order to help constrain our predictions. We're starting to see even more recent papers explicitly including text embeddings alongside data embeddings and trying to align them in a shared space in order to improve overall accuracy of their predictions. So we covered, the diversity of data formats, all the different strategies we might use to include them, as well as, considering text as a data format itself. Now moving on to some other particularities of physics data, and in particular, this is thinking about particle physics data, is thinking about anomalies and what we even mean when we say that we're doing anomaly detection in physics. And in chatting with other statisticians in recent months, it's been funny to realize that when particle physics people talk about anomalies, uh, versus when statisticians talk about anomalies, we're often talking about completely different objects. So in particle physics, we're usually not talking about, one-off specific outliers, say, but we're really talking about group anomalies or bumps that pop up only in aggregate form. So this motivates an entire class of sort of how we look for rare signals in physics data. And so this might kind of represent yet another way that physics data, the types of anomalies that we care about are different from the kinds of anomalies that we might typically encounter in mainstream ML applications. And so just to make this concrete in particle physics, what that can mean is that we're looking for bumps that accumulate over an extended data taking process. And then we can statistically define the fact that this overdensity is not compatible with a background model, say, and that's how we can report our predictions and our discoveries. Um, so recent ML methods in particle physics are designed to target these types of anomalies, and they've seen some interesting successes on, for instance, CMS open data, being able to sort of rediscover the upsilon particle by deploying these kind of model agnostic anomaly detection strategies on this type of data. Um, We've also applied them in simulated settings to show that using model agnostic machine learning based anomaly detection for group anomalies can really make you much more sensitive to new signals. So here, this is a beyond the standard model signal injected at a small level, like a 1 sigma level. And these methods are well calibrated to be able to find these types of anomalies. And another kind of interesting feature of this is that it actually is not just particle physics that cares about group anomalies. And using the framing of group anomalies, you can sort of see some alignment across other disciplines. So in particular, in astrophysics, there are some examples of bumps here as well. So one of these types of bumps that I'm interested in is something called a stellar stream. And these are kind of remnants of ancient galaxies, and usually they're smaller, like globular clusters or dwarf galaxies that are in the process of becoming incorporated into the Milky Way. And as they kind of orbit the Milky Way's center, gravitational forces stretch out what used to be an original like spherical-ish group of stars and turns it into this long ribbon of stars that's very faint and hard to see by eye. And these are interesting not just for understanding the history of our galaxy, but also potentially for mapping dark matter substructure in the Milky Way. And what's great about them is that they are bump-like, not in position space, as you can see from the picture here on the left. They're quite stretched out in position space. But because all of these stars came from the same globular cluster originally, they all are basically moving at very similar velocities. And so if you switch to velocity space, the stream can show up as kind of a clear resonance along your proper motion features. And so we can deploy a similar strategy to try to find group anomalies as we did in particle physics. And we can also look at this in astrophysics data just to sort of emphasize the similarities of these structures. When we isolate a particular stream, we can really see that the background is a, smoothly falling distribution, just like we see in particle physics. And then the stream shows up as a much more subtle but well-defined bump on top of that background. And so using ML methods that are targeting these types of group anomalies, we can see that ML can kind of rediscover existing streams with no prior astrophysics knowledge. And that's what you're seeing here in red, the stars that are identified by this model, compared with in gray, kind of a more hand-labeled astrophysics baseline. And what's particularly interesting about this type of result is that you can look not only at the spatial distribution, but also the density of the stream, because the density of the stream is what is potentially encoding a history of moving through different dark matter substructure clusters or clumps. So looking at where there are overdensities or underdensities in the stream can really encode that history. And it looks like the ML methods are able to identify these same regions. Cool. So in the last few minutes of my talk, I want to move towards broader, more ambitious ways that we might choose to treat physics data differently, especially as we think about building larger integrated models. And the first thing I want to emphasize is how multimodal physics data is. So first, that means defining a modality. It's modality is like a squishier concept than I think I even appreciated a few months ago. So there are, different ways of defining this, but I think a helpful intuitive definition is that a modality is a specific way of perceiving the world, and an intuitive way of understanding a modality is thinking about our own five senses and the ways in which we take in information about our world in different formats. In machine learning, modalities are a bit more well-defined. They include text, audio, video, etc. And we see this pop up all the time with workshops that are dedicated towards multimodality. In mainstream ML contexts, really this small handful of different modalities are what are being considered. But this presents a bit of a problem when we think about physics data. And in particular, well, sorry, first I'll emphasize why ML industry cares about multimodality, why it's useful to integrate these different modalities together, which is that we see pretty promising performance by integrating multiple modalities into a single model. So this is a paper from, or sorry, a figure from CLIP from a few years ago. That was kind of the first paper to really make this case to the larger ML community, arguing that training a model on alignment of images and text is more robust across domain shifts than training a model like ImageNet on images alone. And so we can see that as we sort of go down the rows of this figure, the concept of a banana gets increasingly maybe abstract or different from the original ImageNet dataset. And CLIP in purple in this second column is able to extract pretty good predictions across all of these different variations in a way that really exceeds the more rigid ImageNet that nevertheless was trained on quite a lot of data, but just from a single source. So the hope in physics data is that we'll see similar levels of gains in performance and in sort of transferability by integrating multiple modalities. And we're starting to see some examples of this in physics. So for instance, we can sort of use the exact same model as CLIP, but instead of training it on images and text pairs, we can train images and spectra pairs from galaxies for AstroClip. And the benefit of this is that it creates this nice kind of semantically structured latent space that you can use to do querying and extraction of similar objects. So maybe you want to query with a galaxy image or a galaxy spectrum, and you can do sort of similarity searches within a specific modality, like image to image or spectrum to spectrum, or you can also search in the other modality. And then further, just predicting additional metrics downstream, the aligned latent space that has learned some relationship between galaxy images and galaxy spectra is able to predict redshifts better than a transformer that has not experienced that same kind of alignment trained on image data. So, we're hopefully motivated to explore multimodality in physics because of what we're seeing in other industry settings. Um, that said, physics data has a lot more than just two or even five modalities. And if you consider like even just a single physics detector and you think about all of the different types of readouts that you might get from this kind of detector, um, you start to quickly scale well beyond what we typically see in industry settings. You might have many layers of a detector, different formats. And so maybe in this case, we're talking about 10, 20, or even 50 or more modalities at once. Um, and this is kind of an exciting regime because it does feel like it's not well studied in common ML settings. So in order to try to study this, we are trying to release data that explicitly covers lots of different modalities. So the multimodal universe covers many terabytes of data that also cover many different types of modalities in astrophysics to enable these types of studies. And that data set helped build the foundation for a large-scale astrophysics foundation model. In this case, it was trained on 39 different modalities across astrophysics data sets. So it uses this data set with a lot of different cross-matching with modalities including galaxy spectra, galaxy images, point clouds, metadata in the form of tables, and yeah, lots of other modalities, images, spectra, and so on. And trained in such a way that the model that can then achieve a number of different downstream tasks out of the box or with minimal fine tuning, whether that includes regressing various physical parameters, creating segmentation maps of images like galaxies, or doing similarity searches of certain types of physics objects that you might care about. And you can do a similarity search using cosine similarity across a huge number of different modalities. Cool. And then last up, there are, we've seen a lot of benefits from like truly interdisciplinary foundation models in mainstream ML settings. And so I think about even, any LLM right now is trained across data, including like Shakespeare data and Reddit data and, all the diverse sources of information content on the internet that we might imagine that cover very different disciplines. And yet there seems to be something in the aggregate that really benefits from that kind of diversity in information content of the data. And that said, even the English language is not consistent over time. So we see a lot of benefits to integrating these different data sets, even if the kind of like ground truth is not so solid. Like the ground truth is changing over time, the ground truth changes across cultures, et cetera. And yet even that is helpful. But I think the motivation is even stronger in physics, where we truly are measuring properties that we believe are universal physical laws. And so moving towards multi-detector or even multidisciplinary analyses, I think the cell is even clearer here that we should hopefully see benefits from doing this type of integration. So this makes us think about how well do our models do at transferring to other domains or basically out of data set or out of domain. So we've seen some early signs that scientific foundation models can transfer out of domain, just going beyond their sort of train and test set that they were originally designed for. So here's this in a smaller setting where this is a model trained on incompressible Navier-Stokes and then evaluated on compressible Navier-Stokes examples, but in two regimes where there's kind of a near regime that looks more like the training data and then a far regime that looks very different from the training data. And what we found is that in both the near and the far regimes, the model that had been pre-trained on physics data outperformed not only training from scratch on those regimes, but also other models that were designed to take in video data, but just were not trained on physics video data. And so there's some sort of motivation that maybe these models do contain some useful information as they transfer to new data sets. We've also seen increasing numbers of foundation models that are domain specific. So say in particle physics, which I care a lot about, in recent years, we've seen a number of different domain specific foundation models designed for particle physics data. And some of these are also being tested in new regimes and new data sets. So it does seem like some of these models appear to transfer surprisingly well out of domain, whether that means taking this foundation model of particle physics and applying it to cosmological inference or even like molecular dynamics. So it's kind of like unknown terrain out here, trying to extrapolate and understand just how far we should expect our foundation models to be able to transfer. So my hope is that in the near future, we can start to more concretely define what does it mean to be near or far. Like we have our kind of like historical disciplinary regimes, but it could be that maybe we need something more data driven, or we need to sort of like reframe how we think about the similarities between our data sets and our scientific domains. And I really believe that ultimately a lot of these questions will come down to the shared information content and understanding this kind of nuanced relationship between shared information content of training data sets and model scale and downstream performance, where clearly there must be something to understand about the mutual information between different inputs. So in order to study this in more specifics, more recently, I've worked on this project with a couple of colleagues to produce data sets that are multimodal, so they can, be two modalities, three modalities, or dozens easily, um, that resemble realistic data sets like images, say, or, could be tuned to look like any type of physics data, but nevertheless that have a known mutual information and a known DAG structure that sort of specifies how these different inputs relate to one another. And the hope of this is that we can start to really talk about mutual information in more concrete ways on real data and not just correlated Gaussians or very simplistic data sets. And so benchmark data sets like these will allow us to benchmark mutual information estimators, for instance, to sort of understand like how well do they capture the true mutual information in realistic settings. And hopefully this is sort of refining our understanding of mutual information on these data inputs can help us to construct better methods that can like take advantage of diverse sources in smart ways as we integrate different domains together. Cool. So I'm at the end of my talk. I think some concluding ideas are, it's still an open question. Like, will our analyses benefit from incorporating information across these different data sets? It's clear that today's major foundation models like LLMs were trained on a huge amount of information, but the reason why they have dominated popular conversation so much is in part because of not just their scale, but the generalization capabilities that emerged at certain scales. Um, and that's due to this, blend of model capacity, training data set size, heterogeneity, et cetera. And we don't know yet if scientific foundation models trained on vast heterogeneous data sets will also yield emergent out of the box generalization properties. Um, but to me, this is the cherry on top. It's not a core requirement for building foundation models. So my hope of, kind of the underlying message of my talk today is that I think it would be great if we saw these types of generalization properties, but I still think there's something quite beautiful and valuable in the synthesis of all of this information in the first place. Um, so this brings me back to the title of my talk, which I thought I would return to. It's inspired by a book called Invisible Cities, which it just came to mind to me as a metaphor as I was thinking about integrating many different layers, especially of a city. And this is a beautiful book, and um, it covers basically there's an emperor of a large empire, and there's an explorer. And the explorer goes off to all these fabulous cities and then reports back to the emperor these stories about the cities that he's visited. And so there's all of these like fabulous tales about like, oh, I visited a city that was suspended over a chasm, or I visited a city where all the inhabitants throw out all of their belongings at the end of each day, and then they like start fresh with brand new belongings. And there's a turn at some point in the book where the explorer reveals that actually every time he's describing a city, he's talking about one city, which is in this case his hometown of Venice. And I found this a really nice metaphor. We are going off, taking various layers and measurements of these seemingly very different data sets that are all ultimately saying something about the one universe that we're a part of. And why do we do this? Well, it might be kind of similar to why the emperor wanted to send an explorer out in the first place, which in the book, uh, they say that it was only in these accounts, so only in these stories, was the emperor able to discern the tracery of a pattern so subtle it can escape the termites gnawing. So the emperor is trying to get a handle on what is going on in his empire. Is his empire going to fail? Is it succeeding? And I think for us as physicists, we are also trying to discern some very subtle patterns in our data. And it could be that it's only in the integration of all of these different accounts that we'll be able to detect these types of patterns. Thanks so much.